Well, it's really a privilege to make this introduction of Fred Polak today. Now, I've been here since December of 2023, as Rich stated, and truthfully, I've never seen as many guests, maybe others who have been here longer, but guests who are just coming to hear Fred's presentation. And I think it's an indication of what publicity could do to bring additional people here to see the wonderful speakers that we have. But Fred, you want to come up so I could be side by side with you? So I've known Fred and his beautiful wife, Carrie, for, believe it or not, over 50 years. We actually were at the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey simultaneously. Of course, that was in the last century. So to bring it forward, Fred is an owner of the prestigious law firm Post and Polak, and I could say this without reservation, probably one of the most accomplished trial attorneys in the state, if not the country. He has tried hundreds of cases to verdict, which is very unusual throughout his career, and is still practicing and conducting trials. Today, Fred has a whole presentation, but he will start by telling the story of how his parents fell in love while they were being held in a Nazi concentration camp in Germany during World War II. So Fred, take it away, and can't wait to hear.
Bob, thank you for those kind words, and to the old guard, thank you very much for inviting me. Before I begin my presentation, it's actually a small world because your speaker last month, Jim Kostler, I know very well. In fact, I was one of the prosecutors who worked with him on the organized crime cases that he so brilliantly orchestrated to success. Primo Levi was an Italian chemist, Holocaust survivor from Italy. Microphone. Thank you. Primo Levi was a chemist from Italy who was a Jewish Holocaust survivor. He spoke eloquently of his experiences, and one such quote is as follows: "In every part of the world, wherever you begin to deny the fundamental liberties of mankind, you move towards the concentration camps." The president of the German Federal Republic from 1984 to 1994, speaking of the Holocaust, said, "Anyone who closes his eyes to the past is blind to the present. Whoever refuses to remember the inhumanity is prone to new risks of infection." In short, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. I will talk to you today as a child of Holocaust survivors, briefly describe what my parents went through, show you a few excerpts from a documentary that was made of their lives, and close by asking you to consider some lessons to be learned from the Holocaust. My full name is Frederick Benno Polak. When we immigrated to the United States, my mother realized people had difficulty pronouncing the last name, so it became Polak. Frederick is the paternal grandfather I never met. That's because he and my paternal grandmother, who I never met, were shipped in a cattle car to the death camp of Sobibor, where they were murdered. Benno is the uncle I never met, my mother's brother. That's because he was shipped to the Mauthausen death camp where he was murdered. My father had 3 sisters. One, Jules, died in Bergen-Belsen towards the end of the war, another concentration camp. Like so many others, she contracted typhus and died. A second sister, Leisha, had a very unique experience, just as my parents did. In 1944, 200 concentration camp people in Bergen-Belsen were shipped to Palestine in exchange for German Templars, in exchange very little is known of. She lived into her 90s, had 4 children, 8 grandchildren, and participated in the development of Israel as a country. My father had a 3rd sister, Betty, another very unique human being. She tried to persuade my father and his first wife not to go into internment when they were forced to do so by the Germans. She saw what was going to happen. But like so many others in Europe, most Jews did not realize that. She went into the underground. She became a resistance fighter. She and her husband, Philip, the uncle I never met, were eventually caught by the Gestapo. Philip was tortured to death. Betty, being the unique person she was, somehow persuaded the Gestapo that she wasn't in the resistance and that she wasn't Jewish. She lived till 105. She died last month. An interesting story about Betty. Immediately after the war, she was approached by someone who said, "We need paper." There were shortages in Europe of everything, including paper. This individual said, "We wanted to get a book published." Betty went to the head of the Dutch ministry where she was working and said, "I need the paper." He said, "We have a shortage. I'm not going to give you the paper." She said to him, "I know exactly what you did during the war. You either give me the paper or I'm going to let the authorities know." She got the paper. What was the book? The Anne Frank Diary. My family's from the Netherlands, also known as Holland. 110,000 Dutch Jews were deported. Only 5,450 survived. That's under 5%. Among those who survived the concentration camps were my parents, my maternal grandparents, and my mother's sister. The percentages in our family were a lot better than in most. But my mother, along with my father, lost countless cousins, aunts, and uncles. My mother alone lost 50 aunts, uncles, and cousins. In total, only 10% of Dutch Jews survived. And it was only 5% for those who were deported to the concentration camps. So as I recount my parents' unique story, I think you will agree with me, it's a true miracle that I was ever born. My father, Jack, Jaap in Dutch, and Catharina, always called as Ina, were raised in Amsterdam. My father got married in his late 30s to a woman named Manja. As with all Jews, once the Nazis took over Holland, he suffered from indignity upon indignity before he was deported. Many of you have seen the yellow stars the Jews were required to wear, and in fact, we still have his yellow star. One day, he was rounded up with 10 other Jews. They were marched by the Nazis through Amsterdam. At one point, they were put against a wall, and the Nazi commander said, "Ready, aim," and my father thought, "This is it, my life is over." Then they shot their rifles into the air. The Nazis had a good laugh, and my father, again, luckily, survived. Eventually, my father was deported to a camp called Westerbork. It was on the Dutch-German border, and it's where most Dutch Jews were deported. Eventually, also, my mother and her parents and her sister were deported to the same camp, and my father's parents had also been at that camp. My father had briefly met my mother before the war, and knowing that his marriage was not good, said to himself, "That's the woman I should have married." And when my father saw that my mother had arrived at Westerbork, despite the fact that she was married, he attempted to start to develop a relationship with her. She was reluctant. She had a boyfriend who she expected to marry. Little did she know that that boyfriend, Rudy, had been shipped to Auschwitz and immediately gassed to death. And so, eventually, my mother started to reciprocate. And what they did was exchange love letters. They tried to hide the relationship from my father's wife. They tried to hide the relationship from my mother's parents. Those love letters survived. My father's love letters to my mother survived the war, and some of my mother's survived. And eventually, they were made into a book called Steal a Pencil for Me. More on that in a few minutes. At Westerbork, the German transit camp, every week 2,000 prisoners were shipped to notorious concentration camps. Most went to the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Sobibor. The, quote, lucky ones went to Bergen-Belsen, which was a work camp. My father was among those lucky ones, and a few months later, so was my mother. My father saw that my mother had arrived at Bergen-Belsen, and they resumed their relationship as best they could under those very difficult circumstances. Now, to reinforce the miracle of what I speak in terms of my ever being born, 93 cattle cars totaling 100,000 Jews left Westerbork. 60,000 went to Auschwitz. Of those 60,000, 500 survived. 34,000 were deported to Sobibor. The percentages were even worse there. Only 19 survived. 4,000 went to Bergen-Belsen. 1,100 survived. Less than 25%, but far greater percentage. Every Monday evening at Westerbork, the list of those to be deported to what they thought was at worst a harsher work camp was read in the barracks. No one knew of the death camps. When my father's parents' names were called and he saw that they were going to Sobibor, he gave them work boots, thinking that his father would simply be working under harsher circumstances, not knowing he would be immediately murdered. Looking at the percentages, my father and mother had a 4% chance of going to Bergen-Belsen rather than the death camps. And ultimately, they were among the 2% of those who were in the camps who survived. A little more about Westerbork. My father eventually became the principal of the school there. Yes, they had a school with some 800 students, but it was a school like no other that you could imagine. Why? Every week, 200 children got notice that they were being shipped to the extermination camp, and then they'd be replaced by 200 others. In all, some 30,000 children were deported from Westerbork, most to Auschwitz, where over 90% quickly went to the gas chambers. You may ask, why not try to escape? Well, no one knew of the death camps. All held out hope that it might be harsher where they were going, but they would survive. The other deterrence was anyone who tried to escape from Westerbork and was caught was immediately killed. So my father ends up in Bergen-Belsen. He would work 19-hour days in front of SS officers with their dogs. I never knew as a child why my father was so deathly afraid of dogs until I learned of his experience at Bergen-Belsen. He and others were made to stand out in the cold for hours. The filth was indescribable, and many got dysentery. The food was rancid. Most survived on a broth of turnips and water. If they were lucky, there might be a piece of horse meat in the broth. But my father got lucky again, because at some point he was transferred to the kitchen. He was able to grab a little bit of food, and he snuck out treats to my mother, such as radishes and onions. As the Allied forces, Americans and British from the West, Russians from the East, started to win the war and approach parts of Germany, the Nazis rounded up most of those who were still living in Bergen-Belsen and put them on 3 trains. My mother, grandparents, and aunts were in one such train. 2,400 people hoarded into cattle cars. The conductor of the train was given an order: run the train into the Elbe River and kill all on board. But as the US troops got closer, the conductor was bribed to stop the train, and the Americans liberated all on the train, including my mother, my maternal grandparents, and my aunts. They had survived. Joel, could you show the photo of the train? So, this is a photo taken by an American Army officer who comes over a ridge and sees this train here and sees all these people just sitting there. They had no idea what they were observing. Somewhere among these people is my mother. And eventually, two of those officers wrote a book on their experience. And I want to tell you an interesting story. I belong to a book club, and every 2 months, one of the people in the book club makes a recommendation on a book. And so someone said, how about A Train Near Magdeburg? I understand it's interesting. I had no idea what it was about. I get the book, and I see it's the story of two American officers and about a train that left a concentration camp. I said, isn't that interesting? My mother was on such a train. My father was on another train. And then I read, it's one of the trains from Bergen-Belsen. And I said, I wonder, it's one of my mother's trains. And I start reading the book, and this photograph is in the book. And it's a photograph my mother showed me time and time again. And then, as I'm reading the book, I find a quote from my mother in the book. And one of the things she had always said to me in the book is, as she saw the American soldiers, and she saw the bright white teeth, she said, they must have all gone to the same orthodontist. And then on the next page is a quote from my aunt. I had no idea the book existed, and yet someone in our book group just came up with it. My father was put on another train. It became known as the Lost Train. It had just carried a load of people who contracted typhus. And soon most of the people on that train became infected with typhus, including my father. It traveled eastward for 13 days with almost no food for anyone. At times, as the Allies were bombing, people would leave the train. At one point, my father went into the forest with 2 other people. When the bombing stopped, he had a decision to make: go back to the train or stay in the forest. But his first wife, Manya, was still in the train, and he felt an obligation to return to her. After the war, he ran into a family member of one of the other 2 people who were in the forest with him. The 2 were never found again. Luck, happenstance, a choice one makes. At times, the train stopped, and my father was one of the ones who had the responsibility to carry those who had died during the night off and give them as decent a burial as he could. After a few weeks, the Russian army liberated all on the train, but most had contracted typhus, most had died. My father was down to 80 pounds, and he went into a coma. Miraculously, he survived. My father returned to Amsterdam. He found my mother. He divorced his wife. He got married. And I was among the first of the wave of Jews born to Holocaust survivors in Europe Once the Cold War started, and the Korean War began, and with the absence of a Jewish community in Holland, which saddened my parents and maternal grandparents decided they wanted a safer country. And we immigrated to the United States, my parents, my brother, and I. I was 4.5 years old. An amusing story. When I started kindergarten, I could hardly speak English. And among the first 2 English words this good Jewish boy ever said were immaculate conception. Now, how did that happen? Well, the community we moved to, all the kids, all my friends belonged to the Immaculate Conception Church, and they would talk about it all the time. I wonder what my parents thought they were getting into. Long after my brother, my sister, and I had left the house, my sister came across my parents' love letters in the attic of our house. My parents had never mentioned them. She and my father had the letters translated from Dutch to English, and it was made into this book, Steal a Pencil for Me. My sister's a talent manager in Los Angeles, and among her friends is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. She had been nominated for an Academy Award. She saw the book, she read it, and she said, I want to make a documentary on your parents and their very unique Holocaust story. She did. It was released to very favorable reviews. It won awards at a number of film festivals. And it was really one of the first documentaries to ever be shown on a new concept, a new streaming service. It was called Netflix. So why don't we take a moment now, and Joel, if you'll bring it up, we'll see a few excerpts from the movie.
Things started to happen. You couldn't drive a car anymore. You had to hand in your bicycles. You had to hand in your radios. And then you had to hand in all your valuables.
We really didn't have the feeling that our lives were in danger. With every measure you thought you could live with it. You were only allowed to do shopping between 4 and 6. So you would go only shopping between 4 and 6. Teachers are not allowed to teach anymore at the universities and schools, so they were teaching at the Jewish schools. I remember the first year we went still to the seashore. The second year we couldn't go to the seashore anymore. My father was an accountant and we had an office together. The Germans stormed in and said everybody out, every Jewish one stormed out. And they were taking us all walking through Amsterdam. For a German, a Jew was like an animal. When we came to a square, they took out of the 410 people, and I was one of the 10. They put us against the wall, and then 10 Germans came with their guns drawn.
And a Jew says a special prayer, the Shema prayer, when his death comes. And I really saw at that moment that my time had come. And they did not kill me, they were shooting in the air. All the Germans, they were laughing their heads off. And kicking my back, and I was allowed to leave. But it gave me a tremendous amount of willpower to say, if I can survive this, maybe I have a chance.
My brother Benno was taken in a reprisal raid. Eventually they sent him to a notorious camp, Mauthausen. The Germans kept on promising my father that they would get him out. And every time they said, well, probably tomorrow he'll be back. And I remember my sister-in-law walking over to the bridge there to see him come. Of course, it never happened.
Every father and mother had to work, so we had to do something with the children. So we gave them a normal school. And I was lucky, I was a good organizer, and that way I got the job of being the principal of a school. This was all part of the make-believe that Westerbork was not bad and the next camp would be another Westerbork. And I would say 90% of the people in Westerbork believe that. To tell you about the Holocaust is very difficult because I don't understand it. And if I don't understand it, how can those wonderful teachers who are teaching the Holocaust make you understand it? We were very lucky. You know why I was lucky? We went to a concentration camp. We did not go to an extermination camp. But when I look at children, I always can cry. Because then I remember my children in Westerbork, children like you, who we gave a wonderful education. And every week a train left. Westerbork, Auschwitz, Auschwitz, Westerbork. And the children did not know. They thought they were going to another camp, and they all were killed.
They needed every week 2,000 people to be sent to the East. And they didn't really care who they were, as long as they had the 2,000 bodies to go. So every Tuesday morning, a train left at 6 o'clock. The main purpose of everybody's life in Westerbork was to stay out of next Tuesday's transport.
The Orthodox Jews, they refused to eat the soup because sometimes in the soup was a piece of horse meat. Now, to get a horse meat, you had to be unbelievably lucky. Sometimes people thought, I got it.
There were a lot of fights, and it was very often about food.
The moment people died, people grabbed whatever they had. The blanket or the pillow, unless, of course, he had family. But people were sometimes alone, and then people would grab as fast as possible what you could get.
What we went through after our transport out of Bergen-Belsen cannot be described. Our whole transport suffered a very bad spotted typhus epidemic after we left. I myself was on the verge of death for 2 days, but pulled through. Same with Manja.
I mostly recall digging graves, schlepping the dead body from the cattle car into the grave and saying the Kaddish. I remember on April 23, 1945, seeing Russian uniforms, and I said, this is it. I went with a group of people to get food. Then I felt suddenly very weak. Then I got into a coma. I came out of the coma on April 25. All I know is in 2 days, my weight was down to 70 pounds.
I'm Jack Polak. I'm a survivor of Westerbork and concentration camp Bergen-Belsen and being liberated by the Russian army. I'm accompanied with my wife Ina, who was with me in the camps and with whom I'm going to celebrate this weekend our 60th anniversary. Let me just read to you from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Articles 18 and 19. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or believe in teaching, practice, worship and observance.
By the way, in those last two clips, my father was approximately 94 years old. Six million Jews died in World War II, including 1.5 million children. But other groups were also targeted. For instance, those who were disabled or those who were gay. One might say what occurred is incomprehensible. Surely would never be repeated again. On that scale in history, perhaps so. But we've seen this story repeated time and time again on a very disturbing scale. In Cambodia, between 1975 and 1979, 1.4 to 3 million people were murdered by the Pol Pot regime. In Rwanda, in 1994, 60 to 70% of the Tutsi tribe was murdered. Since 2017 in Myanmar, there's been a concerted effort to eliminate the Rohingyas. Between 1992 and 1994, there were mass killings among Serbs, Croats, and Muslims in the Balkan War. Between 1974 and 1991, in Ethiopian civil war, 1.4 million died. Shall I make it more current? In Syria, 620,000 people have died out of a population of 22 million. And perhaps most disturbing, but I don't think many people appreciate it, over the last few years in the Sudan, 2.5 million people have died. Unfortunately, I could go on and on. The subjugation of and discrimination against people because of the color of their skin, their religion, their sexual identity, their nationality, among other, continues to this day. One would have hoped that the lessons of history would have forever put closure on efforts to target and exterminate people simply because of their identity. Unfortunately, it continues. My parents' story is a testament to the power of love, the human instinct to survive, the role of sheer luck and happenstance in determining who shall live and who shall die. But my father felt a burden of one who felt he had a responsibility because he did survive. And that responsibility was to as best he could to try to teach the lessons of the Holocaust to others. He said to me, I have the special responsibility to those who died to try to do some of the work they may have done. So as he got older, and long after my brother, my sister, and I left the household, he decided he had to better earn the life he had been given. He died at the age of 102. And up to his late 90s, he spoke to literally thousands upon thousands who belonged to youth, church, synagogue, school, and civic groups all over the United States. He became president of the Anne Frank Center in the United States. For those of you who are familiar with Anne's story, you'll know that Miep Gies is the woman who hid Anne Frank. When she would come to the United States, she would stay at my parents' house. And she was a beautiful, courageous, unassuming woman. So particularly in connection with his work with the Anne Frank Center and the widespread dissemination of the movie on his life, my father spent the last quarter century of his life conveying his message of lessons to be learned from the Holocaust. The bottom line of what my father attempted to convey in his own unique, compelling way, and what I hope to reinforce to you today, is this: those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. A Holocaust survivor said to his grandson, I should not be alive today. And because I should not be alive, neither should you. But because God gave me life, you and I have to earn the life that has been given to us. And as I've gotten older, raised a family, started to work less hours, I think of my parents' legacy. And now that I have 5 grandchildren, I think of the legacy I want to leave for them. And that's where my father's words more fully resonated to me. So I'm here today, and I'd like to convey to you at least 2 important lessons I hope will resonate with you. Never discriminate. Don't judge anyone because of their religion, the color of their skin, their sexual identity, or their nationality. And don't countenance others to do so. That's what happened with Hitler, the Nazis, much of the German population, much of the Austrian population, and unfortunately, a lot of the population in the rest of Europe. For instance, the Vichy regime. And might I respectfully suggest to you, that means that when you experience any such thing, don't be a bystander. Get involved, speak out, confront discrimination and injustice. In closing, I want to quote Martin Niemöller, who was a prominent German Lutheran pastor. After the war, he said the following: "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, but there was no one left to speak for me." Thank you.
Very moving. And all of you who have questions, if you could come up and sit in the chairs here, and we will get to your questions in the order that you show up here.
Thank you for a very moving presentation, and I think we all reflected on your experience and feel very remorseful about it. I wanted to ask you a specific question. I read the diary of Anne Frank and Otto Frank, the father's diary. He mentioned that in Amsterdam, the census before the Nazis took over, they identified people by religion. Therefore, they were able to round up people that quicker. Is that true or not true? Or this is from Otto Frank. That's what he mentioned.
I don't know the answer to the question, but I would suggest to you, knowing the Dutch, the answer is yes.
My name is Trudy Gompers, Trudy Klein Gompers. I was born in Vienna, Austria, in 1937, February. At the time of the Anschluss, I was an infant, 18 months old. I left Vienna with my parents 3 days before Kristallnacht. They always said that we should have left sooner. But you see, the world closed its doors in our faces. We couldn't get visas. The Nazis made sure we couldn't leave, although they wanted us to leave, because they took away our ability to live. No employment was allowed. No welfare, nothing. Everything was cut off within a couple of months of the annexation of Austria. So we left Vienna 3 days before Kristallnacht, but that's just one of the stories of millions of stories that only the people that actually lived through the difficulties of the war knew and felt. Otherwise, it's just a story. I felt the story today, and it made me cry. But my deeper concern is when Peter and I were invited to Vienna, Austria, by the Austrian government sponsored. It was called Welcome Jews, the Jewish Welcome Service. They wanted us to come and experience a week of welcome to Vienna. Airfare paid, hotel paid. We were housed in an unbelievable old hotel full of Austrian culture, full of the beauty of that had been Vienna before the war. And it was very interesting. They didn't brush anything under the rug. They said, we did wrong, we did terrible things, and we're trying to make it up to you. So we went to Jewish restaurants because we were put, the hotel was housed in the Zweiten Bezirk, that's the second district. And it was a Jewish district before the war, and it still is. And on the Sabbath, you can see religious Jews with their yarmulkes and with their, they call them differently now, the kippas, and prayer shawls, walking the streets as if nothing happened. And then they took us to the memorial and all this stuff. And it was very touching, and we much appreciated their kindness and everything. And then one day we took a ride to the Alps by ourselves. And on the way home, we took a cab. We were very tired. And the cab driver happened to be a black man, an African man. And he spoke a perfect German. I still speak German. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, I realized that I'm still saying my prayers in German. I never knew that. But anyway, the gentleman said to, I said to the cab driver, where were you born? It's a natural question. And he said, I said, you speak such good Austrian without an accent. And he said, I'm Austrian. I said, no, but where did you come from? And he said, 40 years ago, I came from Africa somewhere. He says, but how come you speak German so well? I said, I was born here. He said, when did you leave? And I said, I left 3 days before Kristallnacht. And he says, ah. He said, they're still here waiting for you in the basements. When I speak for the Holocaust, every Holocaust survivor I've ever met speaks about what we want to achieve, what you spoke for, love, the end of all hatred of mankind killing each other, which has happened from the beginning of mankind. We speak for love of all, not just the Jews. But as a survivor, I feel very, very sensitive to the racism and the anti-Semitism that is becoming more and more obvious every day all over the world. My purpose, and I'm sure your purpose too, is to end this disease for all mankind. Thank you.
It's very hard to ask any questions after your story. I just want to say my aunt, my grandmother's youngest sister was a survivor. She ended up in the resistance in Poland, but she lost her 2 children and her husband during the war. The 2 children were still infants, 1 year old and a little bit less. But I read quite a few stories about survivors there, well, more than just the Diary of Anne Frank. There were hundreds out there. And I was just reading one recently about a 13-year-old girl who was sent with her mother, her brother, and her aunt to Auschwitz. And they were unloaded from the cattle cars, and they were going to a point where they were stopped by a man who looked at them and said to the brother and aunt, "You go over there." Said to the mother, "You go over here." Looked at the girl, she was 13, looked at her blonde hair, fingered it for a little bit, and said, "From now on, you're 16, go with your mother." And they went, and of course, later in the process, her hair was shaved off, which went to probably a German wig or who knows what. But she later said that person was Mengele. And it just, what you mentioned, that the amount of luck that was involved in survival, just at that point, the minute she got off the train, if he didn't for whatever reason, didn't say, "You go this way," she would have not survived. And this was early in the process. So when you say luck, it's probably more luck, I would think, than anything else that caused the survival.
Many, many years ago, a family moved in around the corner from us in Westfield. And I'm speaking to Mike. I noticed he had numbers tattooed on his wrist area. I knew exactly what it was. I said, "Mike, you were in a concentration camp?" And he said, "I was 2 years old, and my parents were sent to Auschwitz. And my mother, and then friends, hid me in the barracks for all those years." There's a somewhat famous photograph of American soldiers looking at 5 or 6 young children in the stripes uniform. They had to be between 4 and 6 or 7. And he was one of those children.
Thank you for the moving presentation. I read recently that the Netherlands published a list of suspected Nazi sympathizers or collaborators very recently. Any thoughts on that? I remember your relative used that as a wedge to obtain paper for a book.
Well, I wasn't aware of that, and I'm pleased to hear that that Holland, that the Netherlands has done that. I suspect most of those who were Nazi sympathizers and active members of the Nazi Party are quite elderly now, and it'll be interesting to see how they are treated and handled as a result of that.
Hi. Great talk. I'd love to have you as my attorney when I need one. We have had a number of Holocaust survivors as members, but with the passing of Werner Wolf last year, I think the last surviving Holocaust survivor who was a member has passed on. Werner Wolf was our director in 2001. And as recently as a few years ago, we still had 4 that I knew who had survived. But I think now they're all gone. And maybe our historian could find some records, although that's not the kind of thing that's noted in our records, to just indicate what the involvement has been with Holocaust survivors in the Old Guard, where we welcome all who are interested. Well, that wasn't a question.
No, obviously, but you bring up a good point in that there are very few Holocaust survivors still alive, just too old. And that, I think, makes it incumbent upon the next generation, myself, and the generation after that. Hopefully my son and daughter will continue that, to make sure that we don't forget history, that we learn the lessons of history, and do our best to try to prevent it from occurring again.
Do we have any hands up online? No. Bob, could you come up and thank our speaker for a very moving presentation?
Amazing, extraordinary, emotional. Thank you so much, Fred. Just a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Again, Bob, thank you for asking me to speak, and thank you to all of you for attending and for having me here.
So, Fred, we thank our speakers in 2 ways. One is by providing you with this, the Old Guard Certificate of Appreciation. And as you'll see, our logo here is the orchard. The reason that's there is because, believe it or not, at one point in time, Summit was the orchard capital of the nation, and later on actually went international. So it's there to represent Summit as well as the organization. All right, thank you very much. And the second is the Old Guard Cheer.